The manhwa starts off with a furious man launching a brutal attack at another inmate who looks frightened. The crazy guy, his voice commanding with fury, demanded to know how anyone dared to put him in that hole, and insisted that the warden be brought over immediately. Without wasting a moment, the man tightened his grip on the captive and barked a menacing order for someone to summon the warden. Confronting the tense scene, our boy demanded to know the cause of the commotion and warned with an aggressive edge that he would give only 3 seconds for an answer. With an ominous authority, commanded everyone to leave, sending a wave of fear through the tense room as he strode away, and the others reacted in panic and terror. The crazy guy, his fury barely contained, demanded the warden's presence instead of facing another subordinate, his voice cutting through the tense confrontation. With fury blazing in his eyes, he brandished a knife at the trembling inmate and demanded to know if wanted to watch him slit his victim's throat, making the tension in the room almost unbearable. With a burst of energy, surged forward, his determination fueling every swift step as the intensity in the air reached its peak, as he got ready to launch his baton. At that very moment, his face twisted in fury, launched a vicious attack with his weapon toward the inmate, whose terror was palpable as he faced the incoming blow. Just then the man plummeted helplessly, his face etched with shock as he could help but fall to the ground in pain. As he hit the ground, he groaned in agony and clutched his throat, struggling to endure the sharp pain that surged through him, while getting up and cursing our boy's life. Suddenly, as the defeated opponent struggled to rise, his ferocious presence sent a chilling wave of intimidation through the air as he is seen about to stomp the lights out of the guy. We cut to the room as only silence and stomping is filling the air, the inmates watching in terror. However, breaking the tense silence, fixed his gaze on the room and warned everyone that he needed to make something clear. Then our boy intensified the ominous mood by delivering a chilling threat to the group, warning that if even one of them disobeyed, everyone would be punished, leaving them visibly anxious under his intimidating glare. Stood assertively before the group, commanding everyone with an intimidating tone to keep their heads down and questioning what they were doing. We transitioned to a month earlier. Under a cloudy sky, a sprawling building complex stood as the story's timeline shifted back. Now, as the story's timeline rewinds, we are seen marking the entrance to the warden's office, hinting at the foreboding events about to unfold within. Inside the warden's office, a figure, his voice edged with worry as he poured water that splashed into a cup, informed the warden that the professor was extremely angry, causing him to listen with heightened concern. The man, leaning forward with a smug expression, implied that they both knew the consequences of angering Professor Wu, prompting the warden to anxiously insist that he understood all too well. However, the man, his eyes narrowed with defiance, challenged the warden by demanding if that was truly the best response they could offer. Before the warden could respond, he informed in a serious tone that a new guard would be arriving soon, clutching his document, as the warden stammered out the main character's name in anxious confusion. However, as tension crackled in the air, the man asked what the plan would be if the new arrival proved uncooperative like Lieutenant. In response, the warden, his tone laden with menace, remarked that covering up the situation would be far more difficult if a correctional officer were to die. However, the man, gripping his cup with determination, confronted the warden by stating that he had been put in charge precisely to handle such situations, and if dissatisfied, could take his complaints directly to the professor. Suddenly, startled by a sharp knock at the door, he anxiously demanded to know who was there, fear flickering across his face as tension gripped the room. Meanwhile, noticing the interruption, the man anxiously remarked that it seemed there was a guest and said he should leave, placing his cup as he prepared to depart. Sensing the guy's exhaustion, the warden anxiously urged him to get some rest, his own nerves barely concealed beneath a veneer of support. During the tense confrontation, the inmate, his demeanor intense and assertive, delivered a warning that the professor would meet them personally next time and urged them to remember it. The warden, visibly shaken by the inmate's threat, reluctantly conceded in a trembling voice, betraying his fear as the tension lingered in the air. Just as the inmate was opening the door, he was met by our boy, who gave him the glare of all time, looking at him like the trash he is. Just before not even saying nothing and walking right past the inmate, hurting his ego. However, as tension lingered from his silent dismissal, the guy eyed the new arrival warily and remarked to himself that he distrusted the man's gaze and found him just as untrustworthy as the others. Just then, the warden greeted the newcomer with a cheerful welcome, acknowledging that he must be the new correctional officer, which eased some of the lingering tension in the room. Standing tall and saluting, he confidently introduced himself as Han, announcing that he had just been appointed chief of security at penitentiary. At that moment, the warden expressed his admiration for outstanding civil service exam results and flawless training scores, warmly acknowledging him as an exceptional recruit. Taking a seat, called out to the warden, hinting at an incoming question. Curious, the warden questioned what was going on, as remarking that the inmate who had just left seemed quite familiar with visiting the office. The warden, visibly anxious, tried to defend his actions by explaining that he was only having a brief conversation, and while asked if there was a possibility the inmate had been involved. At that moment, realization struck as, alarmed, pieced together that the inmate might be the one responsible for Correctional Lieutenant's death. The warden, visibly shaken, demanded to know what was meant, insisting that Lieutenant had taken his own life due to gambling debts, while our boy, maintaining his composure, firmly asserted that he had only recently been appointed as chief of security. However, met the warden's accusation head-on, declaring with unwavering defiance that he had not come blindly and was fully aware of the situation. But the warden, slamming his hand on the desk in anger, demanded to know what Officer Han was trying to pull on his very first day, his challenge echoing through the tense room as sat silently. However, his voice charged with intensity, confronted the warden by bringing up the mysterious disappearance of Correctional Lieutenant Park a year ago, leaving the warden visibly stunned by the sudden accusation. Maintaining a stern composure, calmly assured the warden that there was no need for such surprise, emphasizing that he had no intention of revisiting what transpired with those involved in the past. However, the warden, visibly anxious, pressed by questioning whether he truly intended to ignore the matter, to which responded with a skeptical agreement, his calm demeanor barely concealing the underlying tension between them. Maintaining his composed yet intense presence, he clarified that although he hesitated to call it an exchange, he hoped the warden might agree to a small favor in return. We cut to another part of the jail, as someone announced that a new prison officer arrived in the corridor, while we see inmates doing whatever they want. Standing outside the cell, the man in the cell wondered aloud if the officer inside would be willing to cooperate, his tone edged with tension and uncertainty. Meanwhile, as we observe the figure through the barred window, the man outside noted with unease that although he had only glimpsed briefly, the man's defiant eyes made him feel a strong sense of distrust. Inside, closing the Holy Bible with vindictive intent, Professor Wu regarded the situation with grim satisfaction, remarking to himself that taming a rebellious spirit promised a far greater thrill. However, pressing his advantage, he demanded that they bring our boy to him, declaring with unwavering resolve that he alone would determine how to break his will. We then see a man with ketchup, everywhere begging for mercy to Professor Wu to stop his ongoing barrage. Just before being stomped through the pavement by him, while still him to stop. However, as the tension spiked, we hear an inmate yelling to know who the intruder was, causing to draw their attention towards them. Striding menacingly through the darkened hallway, the inmates angrily confronted the potential threat, demanding to know where he thought he was going at that moment. Caught off guard by the unexpected arrival, the man barked orders for his men to seize the intruder and bring to him. Just then, a big guy with all bronze no brain commanded in a cold, domineering tone that should cooperate and follow him, leaving visibly fearful and unable to resist. However, before the guy could react, barked an order for inmate number 5331 to return to his cell, only to be met with the guy's startled question, his confusion sparking fresh tension between them. In response to the surge of confusion, he glared back at the while grabbing him and, unwavering, demanded whether our boy truly grasped what was happening in that moment. However, his tone menacing and final, warned that this was the guy's last chance to return to his cell as the tense standoff hung in the air. Without further ado, our boy tightened his grip on his baton, showcasing that his warning was up. Fueled by his fury, he lunged forward and unleashed a vicious strike with his weapon, his intense expression revealing he had truly reached his limit. As the big guy reeled on the ground, shocked and dazed by the unexpected blow, his stunned companions struggled to comprehend that one of them had just been struck. Meanwhile, the head inmate, growing impatient in the dimly lit corridor, demanded to know why they were just standing there, catching him off guard and deepening the tension. With tension crackling in the air, the head inmate commanded everyone to draw their weapons, his resolute presence propelling the group into a state of urgent readiness. In the tense hallway, the inmate commanded the group to break their target's arms and legs, prompting them to respond eagerly as they all advanced menacingly toward their fearful victim. Meanwhile, surveyed the grim scene with concern, quietly acknowledging to himself that the situation in the dark hallway was every bit as dire as he had heard. With fierce determination, he clenched his hand tightly around the baton, steeling himself for whatever might come next. In the midst of chaos, struck decisively while the inmates fell one after another, our boy showcasing just how strong he really is. With fury blazing in his eyes, the head inmate lunged at our boy, hurling a vicious insult as he brandished his knife in a desperate attack. Eyes sharp with determination, darted aside in a rapid, urgent motion to evade the unseen threat closing in. However, before the guy could recover, unleashed a fierce kick that struck with stunning impact, leaving his opponent momentarily stunned by the sudden assault. Seizing the moment, he surged forward with weapon in hand, his alarm sharpening into resolve as he made a swift, decisive move against his disoriented adversary. Still continuing his 64-hit combo, the blow stuck this guy so hard, his lights flashing before his eyes and seeing heaven for a split second. Suddenly, as the last strike fades, the furious man is thrown into the wall, leaving him at nearly 1 health point. Meanwhile, as he struggled to rise from the ground, remarked with a pained gasp that he seemed quite accustomed to visiting the warden's office, while he loomed over him, radiating dominance. Seething with fury, tightened his grip around the man's neck and taunted him by suggesting that prison life was enjoyable for people like him, as the guy hurled an insult that left frozen. In a surge of urgency, the man warned our boy that he was making a mistake, as his face was about to say hello to the prison floor. We then go back a few moments prior, the warden, furious and authoritative, confronted with a sharp admonition, demanding to know what he had been thinking and stressing that he must never interfere with those dangerous individuals. In response, standing his ground with a defensive tone, explained to the warden that he was simply fulfilling his duties and implored him to provide further instructions. However, his patience quickly frayed as he questioned the warden with a furious glare as he demanded to know where Wu was hiding. We then cut to the guy our boy was just looking for, as he is still in the same position, not even have moved an inch. That is serious dedication, my guy. Meanwhile, the main character strides purposefully down the dim corridor, his determined presence amplifying the ominous tension that lingers from before as he is in search for something. Moments later, enters the shadowy room and, holding a book, confronts the startled Professor Wu by boldly revealing that he knows his true identity. In response, the professor simply offers a menacing grin, his face half-shrouded in darkness as a chilling sense of malevolence fills the air. However, standing his ground with defiant intensity, challenged his opponent to come closer, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. As tension lingered in the air, the scene shifted to the dimly lit music lesson building, its shadowy facade amplifying the ominous mood of the night. The door to the private investigation agency displays a company advertisement while introducing Wu, who was once a college professor. A series of ominous news articles and photographs revealed that Professor Wu founded a cult, engaged in various illicit activities, and was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison for homicide, human trafficking, and other crimes. However, the detective, sitting with a serious expression and holding a piece of paper, cautioned that the man in question was rather cunning, his tone underscoring the need for vigilance despite the damning revelations. Amid the lingering tension, his voice tinged with apprehension, asked if he was truly certain about the man's identity, while the man reluctantly admitted their doubts, leaving uncertainty hanging in the dimly lit room. However, as the uncertainty lingered, the evidence became clearer when a photograph of Professor Wu speaking at a podium was revealed, highlighting that most of penitentiary's illicit dealings were orchestrated by him. Meanwhile, the detective, clasping his hands in contemplation, reflected pensively that overcoming what lay ahead would likely prove far more difficult than he had hoped. At that moment, the detective quietly recounted having once seen Professor Wu at the correctional facility and admitted that the man seemed beyond reasoning, while calmly reassured him not to worry. However, the mood shifted as, his gaze steely and defiant, declared that he had no intention of simply talking, making his resolve unmistakably clear. In response, our boy, his tone cold and intimidating, demanded that Professor Wu come out immediately, intensifying the tension in the dim corridor. However, Professor Wu responded by laughing maniacally while holding his forehead, his arrogance evident as he mockingly dismissed his demand. Moments later, as he approached the barred door, Professor Wu observed the scene with a glint of admiration, remarking inwardly on how impressive it was. Across the cold prison bars, the professor addressed by name in a smug tone, making it clear that the tense interrogation had begun. With a smug grin, Professor Wu made a sinister proposal, asking whether he would consider working with him. Reaching through the prison bars with a hopeful glint in his eyes, Wu explained that he had begun planning something out of sympathy for the inmates and promised the officer anything he wanted in exchange for help. However, in the dim corridor, Professor Wu challenged his unseen companion by suggesting they join him, before abruptly demanding his attention. In response, our boy, his tone sharp and unwavering, demanded that Professor Wu come out immediately, heightening the tension between them. However, adjusting his glasses with a dismissive air, he scoffed that the prison officers here were incredibly foolish, his contempt barely concealed beneath a mocking tone. Moments later, Professor Wu, his smirk deepening in the ominous gloom, challenged by incredulously asking if he was truly rejecting such a golden opportunity. Before could respond, the professor, exuding authority, instructed Mr. to handle him, leaving tense and uncertain as the menacing figure closed in behind. However, as the threat loomed closer, he snapped into action, meeting the incoming attack with a powerful, focused dodge that revealed his determination. With fury blazing in his eyes, the man lunged aggressively at, his growl filling the tense air as our boy braced himself. As the professor stood calmly in the doorway, he remarked to the anxious newcomer that his unease was likely due to being new here. However, his expression turned smug as he issued a chilling warning that continuing like this would only get our boy killed. Before anyone could react, spun around in shock, demanding to know where this hulking figure, now looming menacingly, had come from. However, regaining his composure, he confronted the unseen enemy with clenched fists, taunting that only a fool would have left their cell. Maintaining the tense atmosphere, Professor Wu challenged his opponent by saying he didn't understand the source of such arrogance, his determination barely masking the frustration in his voice. Meanwhile, as the tension mounted between them, Professor Wu coldly instructed that the only requirement was to keep the target alive once the confrontation ended, intensifying the stakes of the looming clash. Moments later, fury blazing in his eyes, the giant unleashed a devastating punch at, whose shocked attempt to block only underscored the raw intensity erupting between them. The sheer force of the blow sent our boy flying backwards, even after blocking it. Before he could recover, the professor, exuding smug confidence, taunted that they couldn't afford to have knocked down already, heightening the tension in their confrontation. With a confident smile, he snapped his fingers and revealed that he had much more in store for his opponent. As the tense silence lingered, the door lock clicked firmly into place, unsealing off what lay beyond. At that moment, a heavy, ominous beat echoed through the air as faced his adversaries with fierce resolve, flanked by intimidating figures, while a chill swept over everyone present. Meanwhile, Mr. Wu strode forward with unwavering confidence, declaring that his offer remained open, though he warned it would only matter if managed to survive. At that moment, Wu instructed his subordinate to inform the warden that he was on his way, prompting him to respond with obedient affirmation as they advanced. Meanwhile, the professor, wearing a smug expression, remarked to his assistant that the new hire seemed quite interesting, piquing further curiosity about the protagonist. At the same time, holding his broken baton and lost in thought, Professor Wu reflected uneasily that he had given a clear warning to the warden. The professor asserted with commanding authority that he expected his officers to be taught how things were run, his intense expression casting a tense shadow over the room. The giant lunges forward with fury, his fierce expression revealing his determination as, caught off guard, reacts in alarm to the sudden attack. A desperate voice pleaded for mercy as a hand clutched the phone, its screen flashing with an incoming call from the warden. Moments later, the lackey, his expression grave, informed the professor that the warden wished to speak with him on the phone before their meeting. Suddenly, the professor, his tone sharp with urgency, demanded the phone from the guy, who nervously under the mounting tension. However, as the tension escalated, he confronted the warden with a piercing glare and demanded to know if the older man truly had a death wish, his voice laced with unmistakable threat. In response, the warden, visibly shaken, pleaded over the phone that he would explain everything, his worry betraying just how desperate the situation had become. However, his desperation mounting, he begged that the chief of security be spared for now, warning that the man's death could bring serious repercussions. Unmoved by the plea, he replied with confidence that the decision was his alone to make, as he held the phone firmly to his ear. However, before the tension could settle, Professor Wu, his anger barely restrained, shouted that the other person should stay silent and not interfere until he arrived. Just then his lackey is sent flying. Just before he could react, his head is restrained by a hand. His focus unwavering, delivers a hard blow with fierce determination, intensifying the atmosphere as his glasses catch the light in the heated moment. Towering over the subdued inmate, our boy confronted him with a litany of accusations, disobeying orders, unauthorized absence from his cell block, and an attempt on a guard's life, his frustration cutting through the tense silence. However, maintaining a defiant edge, he assured them in a low, serious tone that this operation would remain strictly off the books, his ominous promise intensifying the uneasy atmosphere. But before the tension could subside, Professor Wu, his voice shaking with fear as script tightened in a show of dominance, stammered out a desperate question, demanding to know how his captor had managed to appear. Meanwhile, his confidence unwavering, thought to himself that their adversaries were surprisingly resilient when it came to taking a beating. However, as he stood over the battered opponents, he admitted inwardly that restraining himself to merely knocking them out had been a true test of control. Just then, loomed over the cowering figure on the floor, threatening that he would overlook the situation only if there was full cooperation and the answers he demanded were provided, his tone radiating cold authority. Maintaining that icy resolve, he accused the professor of covering up the deaths of inmates within the penitentiary, and with a pointed edge to his words, the professor suggested that if our boy was truly curious, he should release him first so they could finally talk. His patience fraying, he slammed his hand down on the professor's finger with a sharp crack and demanded an answer, the tension in the room escalating. In response, warned in a cold, dominant tone that there would only be one chance to comply, while Professor Wu, gripped by terror, cried out in pain under the mounting pressure. However, still shaken yet trying to defend himself, Professor Wu protested that he didn't understand why he was being questioned, but insisted that order in this place existed only because of him. Fueled by fury, violently crushed another finger with his fist, his anger radiating through the tense silence. However, as his anger simmered, he looked down with a grave expression and instructed that only brief answers were allowed, his tone heavy with determination. With a tense gaze cast downward, he quietly called out his name, his determination flickering beneath the surface. Hearing that name made Professor Wu's eyes widen in shock, as fear etched across his face. Sensing the professor's fear, pressed further with intense urgency, demanding to know if he recognized the name and who had killed the man in question. However, pinned down and visibly terrified, Professor Wu stammered that he had never heard of, desperately insisting he knew nothing about him. At that tense moment, made a decisive move by snapping his fingers with resolute determination. However, the aftermath was immediate, as Professor Wu screamed in anguish, his pain echoing the intensity of his desperate action. Meanwhile, our boy forcefully interrogated Professor Wu, gripping him by the hair and intimidating him with a stern warning that he would only have one chance to answer the easy way. Just then we see another figure approaching slowly with stern footsteps. As someone approached with unwavering authority, the man, his nerves evident, called out to get his attention. With a curious glint in his eye, he initiated the conversation by asking the other man to confirm if he was Chief Han. You can never trust someone with closed eyes. In response, asserted his authority by formally introducing himself as the section head, his tone carrying an unmistakable confidence that immediately set the dynamic between them. Building on that decisive energy, confidently informed that although he was unclear about the current situation, he was responsible for Professor Wu and insisted he could leave the matter to him. In response, he, wearing a smug expression beneath the harsh light, assured that he would see to it Professor Wu was punished accordingly. However, our boy, maintaining an assertive tone, explained that while he valued the offer, managing troublesome inmates was ultimately the chief of security's duty. Moments later, still exuding defiance, he clarified to Mr. that he would never assign his own work to someone else on his very first day. However, picking up on the tension, wearing a smug expression, casually remarked that Script felt unusually strong, subtly insinuating a threat beneath his words. Suddenly, exuding authority, ordered inmate 5281 to accompany him, his commanding tone intensifying the already charged atmosphere as he remained frozen in terrified desperation. However, as the tension escalated, Professor Wu, panicked and struggling against this intimidating grip, frantically demanded to know what was happening while he, clearly worried, pleaded with Officer for support. In the midst of the tension, Professor Wu, his voice trembling with fear, pleaded with Officer to intervene, as remained indifferent, calmly smoking in the background. However, before anyone could react, demanded that hold on. In response, with defiant resolve, pointed his gun back and asserted that he was also just doing his job, expecting to understand the situation. As a shot rangs in the air, we see ketchup splatter everywhere. We then see Professor Wu standing there with a red spot on his prison uniform as he questions what just happened, before suddenly crashing to the ground from the inflicted wound to him. He stated with finality that they should leave matters as they were, his tense action causing to watch on uneasily. With an ominous smile, the man confidently warned that there would be consequences if any more trouble was caused. However, standing with a fierce expression, warned in a simmering tone that he was going to become very angry. Meanwhile, staring intensely at, he demanded to know what he was doing at that very moment. Anxiously admitted he had no idea what the chief wanted from him. However, standing resolute before, firmly warned that he would advise against whatever he was planning, intensifying the tension between them. His expression unwavering, offered his advice to, as a senior, his words carrying the weight of experience amid the charged atmosphere. However, as the tension mounted, the man gripped Professor Wu's clothing and in a menacing tone, implied that his message should be perfectly clear, leaving stunned. With determination etched on his face, he explained that he would escort the injured man to the hospital, insisting he had no desire to let the situation become fatal. However, as the tension lingered, realized with a chill that was the notorious section head. Moments later, as the tension grew heavier, the determined strode through the blood-stained hallway, reflecting grimly that everything had just become far more complicated. Just then, a composed doctor entered the scene and reassured someone that the surgery had been successful, and the patient's life was no longer in danger. While Professor Wu lay unconscious and vulnerable in the hospital bed, the doctor voiced her concern to the party, noting the significant blood loss and one wondering aloud when the patient might finally regain consciousness. In the tense hospital room, the doctor replied with calculated ambiguity that it was difficult to know for certain, prompting to question her further with a hint of skepticism. Sensing the lingering skepticism in the air, the doctor maintained her resolute demeanor as she announced that she needed to leave. As the doctor exited, responded with polite gratitude, thanking her for her assistance. However, he warned Professor Wu not to hold his actions against him, his tone laced with an ominous undertone. Moments later, he stated with chilling certainty that if he hadn't intervened, Professor would have surely died, the grim atmosphere thickening around the hospital bed. As the atmosphere remained heavy, the man stood pensively by the unconscious patient's side, quietly wondering why the new chief of security would have attempted to kill him. Meanwhile, as suspicion lingered in the air, the man strode purposefully through the rows of hospital beds, internally questioning the true identity of the mysterious before him. Just then, issued a firm command to return, and the man responded promptly with respectful acknowledgement. The man anxiously expressed his concern about the consequences of Professor Wu being shot, calmly reassured him that there was no need to worry, since all of Professor Wu's had already been rendered powerless. However, the guard reacted in shock, demanding to know who could have possibly defeated those monsters. In response, explained with concern that it had been just one person who emerged completely unscathed, while the guard anxiously pressed him on whether he should have shot him instead. Meanwhile, weighed down by regret, silently wondered whether everything might have changed if he had aimed his gun at instead. At that moment, haunted by the thought, delivered a chilling realization as he confided that had circumstances been different, he himself would have ended up on that bed. Meanwhile, the doctor, warily observing the duo as they strode away with determined purpose. Meanwhile, as the doctor watched them leave, she, gripping her phone, informed the person on the other end that they had just departed. Moments later, she added in a steady voice that Wu would regain consciousness in a few days. Meanwhile, our boy, sounding satisfied as he finished his report call, commended the person on the other end for their good work. However, as the call ended, he glanced at his phone and admitted to himself, with a resigned sigh, that things would take longer than he had anticipated. As the sun dipped lower, he gazed pensively over the field of black flags, wondering to himself what it was truly hoped to find among everything. With a serious expression, called out to, his voice cutting through the tense silence. We cut to a courthouse, as the judge addressed the court with grave authority, asserting that the brutality of the crime left little doubt a severe sentence awaited the defendant, intensifying the courtroom's heavy atmosphere. Moments later, the judge pronounced that was to serve 20 years in prison, causing him to stand in stunned silence beneath the harsh lights as the somber verdict settled over the courtroom. Suddenly spun around in shock, instinctively reacting to the unexpected scene before him. Without hesitation, he turned to, and he asked with clear worry if was all right, his voice betraying deep concern for his friend's condition. Overwhelmed by guilt, apologized earnestly, his remorse evident as he insisted that he was truly sorry. Hesitating and chalking on his words, clearly scared to speak up. Suddenly gathering his courage despite his fear, he pleaded desperately for one last favor as the guard, alarmed, tried to restrain him. However, his eyes burning with determination, as declared defiantly that he had not given up yet and pleaded for another chance. Meanwhile, as the guard restrained him, he pleaded earnestly to trust him, his hope shining through the desperation in his voice. As the sun dipped low, our boy, his resolve unwavering, insisted that he had never doubted and speculated that its apparent demise must be linked to the true mastermind behind the murder. Moments later, clenching his fist with determination, he vowed to take charge and assured that they could entrust everything to him now. As the sun set behind the distant prison, stood resolute, silently vowing that he would find his enemy no matter what. Meanwhile, in a tense office cloaked in fading daylight, shared his worries about a critical issue while the warden listened nervously. As gravely suggested that Professor Wu might not be the true target, the warden, visibly unsettled, questioned the motive behind such a misleading move. In response, wearing a confident and analytical expression, explained that was likely seeking information from Professor Wu, since he was the one who knew the most about the facility. Moments later, the warden's frustration grew as he questioned whether Professor Wu could have simply told what he wanted, but unyielding, replied that this was not an option. However, the warden, his anxiety mounting, urgently voiced his fear that allowing our boy to roam freely might result in yet another disaster. Still tense, he clenched his fist and resolutely insisted that, as he had already explained, granting the request was simply not possible. However, sensing the lingering tension, the warden attempted to deflect the pressure by nervously laughing and suggesting that there must already be a plan in place, though his unease was still evident. Just then, a sharp knock at the door startled him, prompting the warden to stammer nervously as he asked who was there and invited them in, his anxiety now heightened by the unexpected interruption. The warden, startled by the sudden appearance of his employee, at the doorway recognized Chief Han with a mix of surprise and apprehension. However, as the tension thickened in the office, the warden nervously insisted that if the matter was not urgent, should return another time, but quickly reconsidered and invited him to sit. As the atmosphere shifted, the concerned warden hesitantly asked if everything was truly all right, to which calmly reassured him that it was. However, then remarked that he hadn't realized officer was present, and sensing the unease, quietly offered to leave if it would help ease the tension. Before could step out, our boy assured them both that he actually wanted to speak to them together, prompting to wonder aloud about the purpose of this unexpected conversation. At that moment, his tone tinged with relief, responded to the anxious inquiry about Wu and reporting that, fortunately, Wu was still breathing. However, as the tension lingered, he firmly stated that he would be the one to check on the patient at the hospital starting tomorrow, prompting to remind him that he had already advised against taking any further action. In response, visibly disturbed, questioned officer's interpretation by asking since when advice needed to be treated as a command, as tone attempting to deflect the tension with forced humor. Unmoved by the attempt at levity, lined in with suspicion and pressed further, suggesting that keen attention to Professor Wu hinted at a personal grudge. However, looked down thoughtfully and admitted that he had hoped Professor Wu might know something about the person he was searching for. In response, maintained his composed demeanor and gently suggested that could have simply asked him, then calmly inquired whom he was seeking. Fixed him with a piercing glare and announced in a steely tone that he was looking for, the tension in the air rising palpably. With a skeptical smirk, questioned our boy, asking if he was joking and whether the man in question was already dead. In response, defiantly affirmed that he already knew, his determined gaze intensifying the tension between them. As the tension lingered in the air, gravely explained that most of the men brought here were murderers, emphasizing that this particular case was especially controversial. However, the man, wearing a smug expression in the ominous light, coldly insinuated that had murdered his own just before their wedding. Meanwhile, his voice tinged with worry revealed that according to what he had heard, the body still remained missing. In response, exuding confidence, explained that it was only natural since the man had plunged into the ocean after a failed prison escape. However, pressed further by demanding to know how could be so certain of the man's death when the body was never recovered. At that, the warden, visibly agitated, insisted that nothing surrounded them but ocean, while his patience fraying, challenged what point was trying to make as their argument escalated. Suddenly, his voice unwavering, demanded that the case be reinvestigated and requested the officer's cooperation, leaving the warden stunned and quietly observing the tense exchange. However, still skeptical and unsettled by his determination, countered that cooperation would be difficult without concrete evidence of survival, while the warden pointedly asking if there was any real reason to reopen the case. At that moment, as tension thickened, grimly exposed the shocking revelation that had been murdered was his younger sister, and asked the two if that was a good enough reason as tension rose through the roof.